Welcome back to the City Current Radio Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Park. We're honored to be joined by our good friend for a very important conversation, Terri Lee Freeman. She is the president of the National Civil Rights Museum. And first, before we even ask you how you're doing, I feel like we need to just say, first and foremost, it's important for all of us to know there is no place in this world for racism, for hate. When you look at what's going on in America and around our world, I think it is one of those that it's nice to see that people are standing up, but we still have so much to do, so much learning and understanding, and we need to be upstanders. And when you look at the tragedies of the lives lost, to me, it's heartbreaking to see that a person's skin color can limit their potential and also to risk their lives. I think that that's an absurdity that we need to be a part of solving and coming together to do something about. And so let's start, Terri, on your end. When you look at what's going on, how do you look at this in perspective to the work that you do with the National Civil Rights Museum?
Sure. So thank you, Jeremy, for having me today. Let me just say that the mission of the museum is several-fold, is the way that I like to describe it. We want to make sure that we are promoting the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. We want to make sure that we are chronicling the stories and the history of the American Civil Rights movement. But we also want to make sure that we are talking about the continuation of the struggles that take place in the realm of civil and human rights. And I think right now we're in the midst of that. And then finally, we want to serve as a catalyst to inspire people to do something. And I think, again, now is a great time for everyone to do something.
When you look at, I love what you've done with the museum in the sense that it walks you through a journey, a learning journey, and it goes way back in time so that you have an understanding. And I feel like that part of this, and you're seeing this unfold, is listening and learning and better understanding each other so that we realize this isn't something that just started today. This has been going on for a long time. Right. And it's systematic in ways that we'll never understand on our end. But part of that is we have to be willing to start understanding and looking at that.
Exactly. You know, we present the true story. We're going to give you the facts. We're going to give you what actually happened. To not want to accept that fact, those realities, well, that's on individuals, right? That's not on the museum. But the museum presents the true story of Africans being stolen from Africa, brought to this country, enslaved, and the beginning, frankly, of a movement of resistance, to always fight for freedom, to always fight for equality, to always fight for equity. That is the journey that we try to take people on as they come to the museum. You know, one of the things that I think is a real tragedy is that people come to this museum often and they say, well, why did I not learn this? We're not teaching this history. And this history is not just African American history. It is American history. It should be taught. It should not be taught in just one grade. We should have a continual teaching of this history throughout traditional education. And if we did that, people would be far more educated and would see how, well, where we are today is rooted in where we were 400 years ago.
And I love one of the sayings that you put out there often is, if you don't know your past, you're doomed to repeat it. Mm-hmm. And so I think, and there's so many things that even I'm learning that you just maybe didn't think about, but like even the fact that Band-Aids were a certain color of skin, and all of a sudden now, like, you realize, wait a second, there were different colors. And then even going back to one of the exhibits on your end, realizing that, you know, the white dolls were positioned as more supreme than the African-American and the black dolls. And so little things that just get baked in at an early age. And I feel like you're seeing now, like, all these books that you need to be reading to your children at a young age. And so there's a lot more around understanding now of what was baked in.
Right.
What are some things on your end that are kind of related to that that you think people need to really start paying attention to?
Well, I think that what people have to understand is this is really about how we treat each other. I mean, it's simple. It's so simple it becomes complicated, right? Um, it's really hard for you to put your knee on the neck of a human being. It's not if you don't see them as a human being. So until people see each other, and in particular, Black and Brown people, as human beings, we will be treated less than. Now, that's not my work to solve, right? That's the white community's work to solve, to be able to see Black and Brown people as being the same as them, no difference whatsoever. And again, that difference was baked into our being here in this country. It was baked in that we would be, 3/5 of a person, not a full human being. And unfortunately, some of that is carried on. You were speaking of the Band-Aids. I think to myself, Essence Magazine was founded in 1970. It was the first magazine founded to really elevate Black women and Black beauty. 1970, 1970, before we could say that Black women, Black children, Black men, Black boys and girls were beautiful. And just think about that the picture of what was beautiful and what Black people were told was beautiful did not look like them. And so there are so many things that have been ever present in our society that have continued to kind of chip away at who Black people in particular were, but Brown people as well. And right now, we are seeing a movement that says, okay, George Floyd was a tipping point, but that this is not just about George Floyd.
One of the things that I'm not going to get it correct, but it was on a post, and it was a young girl holding up a sign that basically said, "We're not saying that it's only Black Lives Matter. All lives do matter, but we're just saying that Black lives matter. And so we're a piece of the whole. We just want you to realize that we are being singled out and hurt." And so it's not an or, it's an and I think
Well,
that's a proper perspective to put it in as well.
I heard someone say just yesterday, all lives matter will be a true statement when Black lives are a part of the all. So if you believe that all lives matter, why are you so offended when I say Black lives matter, right? If all lives matter, that should not even be an issue. And so I think we can fairly realistically say that sometimes Black lives matter. And I think what this movement is saying is that Black lives must always matter. And then we can talk about all lives mattering once Black lives are included in that.
When you look at, there's so many legacies with Dr. King. One of them is the Voting Rights Act.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at some of the positives that could come out of this, and you look back historically at some of the positives that came out of obviously the protests and what was going on then, what do you think some of the positives, or what do you look for some of the positives to be coming out of these protests and statements and movements?
Well, I think one of the positives that I've been thinking about is just that there is a higher level of awareness of the issues that African Americans face on a daily basis between the moment they wake up in the morning and the time they go to bed at night. And accept that experience as truth, right? So just because you don't experience it doesn't mean that it's not true. So that's one thing. I hope that we get some changes to policing. I hope that we will have policing that truly is uh, involved with the community. Um, I'm not an expert on policing tactics, but I think that when you work with people as opposed to working to control people, that you generally get a better outcome. It's interesting what you say about voting, though. Um, my hope is that we will get more people understanding what it means to vote and why it is so important, and why we're not just talking about presidential elections, why everything that comes up is important, and why it does make a difference when one person, doesn't vote and does not exercise that franchise. I don't think that if there's one right that we have beyond freedom of speech, this idea, one man, one vote, is critical to democracy, right? And so we have to exercise that vote that we have and know what you're voting for. Don't just vote because, oh, I think I know that name. That's not good enough. So I think that a part of the change could be increases in people who are voting, but what we will have to do is continue to educate people on why and what, and allow them to be informed and educated voters. Those are some of the immediate things. I will say that this whole protest coming on the heels, it's not on the heels, in the middle of a pandemic that made plain and laid bare the inequities in the healthcare system, the fragility of America in general around how it survives economically. This has not been a long period of time that we have been in this pandemic, yet it has had severe consequences for individual economic issues as well as business interests. And I think that what we've always known is that, and I wrote a piece that said it's true, when America catches a cold, Black America catches pneumonia. We've known that, but now that we know it and we've seen it played out and we know that we are only as strong as our weakest link, it would seem to me that we would want to ensure that we are strengthening our weakest link so that more people could survive this sort of a situation, both from a health perspective and from an economic perspective. So this coming on the heels of something that already made plain the inequities in our healthcare delivery and healthcare access, and the folks who are essential, who didn't used to be considered essential, and how it all plays out. It was the first warning system for us that things were totally out of kilter.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the healthcare reform, because I think, just like you mentioned with the police reform, it goes to all levels, all industries, all systems.
Mhm.
I think that's an important, just like you said, a very important piece of this. I want to go back to something you said about kind of the relationship element of this. I think as a society, it's easier to, if you're not building relationships and out there and getting to know each other, once you start serving together and you work together, I feel like it becomes impossible to treat someone as a number, because you get to know them.
Mhm.
If you don't and you're disengaged, then it's one of those where it's easier to just say, oh, well, da 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 da. And I feel like that's a big problem with society, is we're broken, and we've created these theoretical walls and boundaries that should not exist. And I feel like that's where the more we can come together and serve together and work together and get to know our hearts, the more we'll want to create this change. And I feel like that's a big part of this movement as well, is breaking down those walls. And I say that to ask, there are so many who are struggling with what to say how to say it, how to not be tone deaf, how to use their skills for good. And you and I talked about it, is it's not just the words, it's got to be the actions, and we've got to take action. What would you say to especially the white Americans who want to help and want to do what's right, but just don't know what that is?
So there are a couple of things, Jeremy. I would say, first thing, recognize that privilege is real and that you have privilege and that you should use that privilege for the greater good. So you will walk in circles that I may never be in. If you have the chance is the wrong word, but if you're in a circle and you hear something that's inappropriate and you know it's inappropriate, you have to say something. That's your responsibility. I'll never be in those circles. And even if I was in those circles, them listening to me as opposed to them listening to you are two different things. So I think you really got to use the privilege that you have to push back on people who think otherwise. The second thing is what you said. It's about what your circle look like. And there's nothing wrong with people wanting to be around like people, but what that means is that you have to accept that there are other people who are not necessarily like you, and that just because they aren't like you doesn't mean that they're less than you, right? I think the third thing I would say is don't believe everything you see on TV and read in the paper, or certainly not everything that you read on social media. Get to know somebody. Get to know somebody. And right now, in the middle of this, understand that every Black person you see is hurting in some way because of this. It hurts. We think back to experiences that we've had. Some have been very similar to some of what we've seen over the course of these past couple of weeks. Others have been subtle, insidious, but painful nonetheless. And so if you ask someone, how are you feeling? And they're snappy about it, you need to give them a little bit of grace, because this is hard. This is difficult. We're answering questions that our children have about why this happened and why people don't like people who look like us. We're having to answer those questions. And we have been trying to get people to hear us for a very, very, very long time. I'm happy we are where we are, that we are having people listen. And I know that there are so many, I don't want to call people just allies. I want to call them accomplices. I want to know that people are willing to have to sustain the same type of retribution, if you will, that I would have to sustain. So we have a lot of accomplices. And I think that has been truly the beauty of what we have seen played out in our communities across this country, frankly, across the world. It has been a coalition of many. A coalition of many different people, different ethnicities, different religions, different sexual identities, all fighting for the cause of freedom. Because again, if Black lives matter, then truly all lives matter. So I think that is really important. The other thing is, Jeremy, there are all sorts of resources out there. If people want more information and they're the type that I need to read something, I need to see something, we actually are getting ready to put on our website a source list so people can look at the material that gives you a better insight into why these things are happening. And then I think when you do have a circle that is broader than looking like just like you have the ability to reach out to other people and ask the question. I would just say that it is important that white people are willing to do the work and don't expect Black people to do it for them.
I know for me personally, it's related but a little different in the sense that he's a best friend of mine. He's like a brother. I mean, he literally, I consider him a brother, but he's Filipino,
Mhm.
and I've known him for, gosh, it feels like my whole life. And just yesterday we had a conversation, and for the first time I've ever asked him, what has the effect of racism been on you?
Mhm.
And he opened up and was telling me stories that I had no idea. And this is someone who's like a brother to me. So I feel like, in a really positive way, like you said, when you put the onus on, I've got to do the work. I've got to ask the difficult questions. I've got to be willing to um, give them the space and genuinely want to learn. But when we do, it's so much more powerful. It's humbling.
Mhm. Mhm. You know, we are getting ready to launch what I think is our fourth cohort of a program called Unpacking Racism for Action. And it really is focused on issues of implicit bias and systemic racism. It won't begin, I think, until November. And of course, who knows, it may still be virtual in November, or we may be back to face, but it's a facilitated 7-month long dialogue series about the topic. And one of the things that has been consistent in the 3 cohorts thus far is that people walk into the room thinking they know a lot about racism. And then they realize, oh, but I had never thought about it from their perspective. So I've never thought about it from an Asian American perspective. I've never thought about it from a Latino perspective. I've never thought about it from a trans perspective. And the facilitator really talks beyond Black and white, understanding the significant issues and impact of Black and white,
Right.
but that most people of color, or people who are identified as the other, have experienced some sort of ism. And it's interesting as people go through this series how much they grow, and how much more they want to learn and do after they have come through this 7-month series.
Before we wrap up with the website and everything to go to, give us just one last thought in terms of when you look at the history and what you chronicle with the National Civil Rights Museum, and you look at that as perspective. What would and I don't even want to say words of encouragement be, because that's not the right phrase, but give us your kind of thoughts in terms of hope for us coming together as a nation, as a world, looking at where we've been, but where we could go.
Mm-hmm. So I think that what we saw in the mid-20th century demonstrates to us that we can actually create change. We can make big change. We can affect systems, but it's not easy. And what I like to say to people is that I know you all think that Dr. King was the movement, but he was not. And the movement had factions, and it had fractures and fissures. And yes, he was a huge figure, but he didn't do this by himself, and he wouldn't say that he did it by himself. We shouldn't expect that there has to now be a single person in 2020 that becomes kind of the lightning rod, if you will. So we can't compare it apples to apples when you look at the mid-20th century. But what it does tell us is that organizing is a very, very powerful model. When done well, when done strategically, change can occur. But it doesn't occur without sacrifice, without tenacity, without persistence, and without patience. So we have to have those elements and know we are not in this place today because of what happened a couple of weeks ago. We are in this place today because of many, many years of disenfranchisement, oppression, and in many instances, terrorism. So it's going to take us a while to get out of this. But if the coalition stays together, we are so much more powerful together than we are separated. And we can't allow rhetoric or lightning rod words to keep us apart. We have to understand that we are dependent on our sister or brother, regardless of race, creed, or color. I think that I have always had a lot of faith in the young people of today. They are so much more aware in many ways than my generation was at their age, and they want to do the right thing. They're loud about it, and that's not a bad thing. People need to listen. So I'm encouraged by young people being in this fight and being willing to stay in this fight and looking toward positive change and knowing that the history provides a roadmap for them on how they can affect that change. It won't be easy, but it's going to happen.
Well, we absolutely love you, Terri. Go ahead and wrap up and talk about website, social media. Where can we go to make sure that we're involved, we continue to be involved with these discussions and everything that you're doing on your end with the National Civil Rights Museum?
Sure. So our website is civilrightsmuseum.org. We have all the social media handles at NCR Museum. So NCRMUSEUM, right? So that's our handle. We have a Facebook page. Please like our Facebook page and stay abreast of the things that we're doing. You know, I like to think that, you know, people think the museum has great events. We do have great events, but we have even better content. And so I would encourage people to dig into some of the stuff that we have on our website, on our Facebook page, on our Instagram, and note the small history lessons that we provide on a daily basis, and engage with us. And when we open again, come visit us.
Absolutely. Well, like I said, love you and your team. Thank you so much for doing this. Greatly appreciate it. And definitely look forward to seeing you again soon, especially when the museum opens back up.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.